In the present, there are two primary ways of describing the human psyche: the religious model and the secular one. The religious model is derived from the religious belief that surrounds the subject of the presence of a soul in every living being, and this also serves as a proxy for the majority of religious beliefs in regards to how one lives an eternal life. Souls facilitate the transportation of one's being from our realm to either the realm of hatred or the realm of eternal happiness, also known as heaven and hell. The secular model, on the other hand, is based on what is known about the human mind, and it can be summed up by the mind's reaction to external stimuli. Psychoanalytic theory, as defined by Sigmund Freud, is the theory that all human beings use three levels of consciousness to facilitate reactions or actions. The ego, superego, and id all give way for different reasoning to the same problem. One way to look at it is that the ego serves as the audience in a debate, and the superego and id have to reason their points across to the ego in order to cause a reaction. However, the ego still has its own opinions on these matters, just like the audience of a debate. But the superego and the id have to convince the ego to adopt their beliefs.
Perfect.
The ego, or the self, is the part of the mind that is interacting with the physical world through the use of perception, and can therefore impact something other than itself. Consequently, the actions that are made by the ego carry much more weight, and are usually made with input of both the superego and the id, the good and the bad respectively. Perhaps one of the most integral parts to understanding the functions of the ego is understanding the reality principle, which is the principle that serves as the foundation for the actions that are made by the ego. The way the reality principle works is fundamentally based on finding the best way to a goal with the least social consequences. It does this by compromising the instant gratification or satisfaction of an action by doing something less irrational in order to still attain the goal, but also to avoid the social neglect that could come as a result of acting simply through the desires. So the ego does take norms and social expectations into account, but it leaves the right or wrong out of the equation. A strong ego can be ascribed to individuals that are able to distance themselves from situations that are less beneficial to them in terms of consequences that they deem less favorable. People that do not succumb to social pressure and expectations are usually people that have a stronger ego than those who find it hard to balance one's own desires with those of a group. Consequently, people that have a weaker ego usually struggle to understand what consequences are connected to their behavior and can therefore find themselves at the bottom of a pit with regard to the cascade effect. However, it is important to grasp that nothing is inherently good or bad, and the use of good and bad in this instance is only to represent the popular opinion.
The id is the part of one's psyche everyone is born with. It is the unconscious part of our mind and is responsible for impulsive needs and desires. Thereby, it is very impatient and wants desires to be fulfilled now, disregarding the social consequences. As long as it gets what it wants. In simpler terms, it operates on the basis of the pleasure principle, which is the crave for instant gratification. This animalistic self does not change nor disappear over time when one grows up, but instead, over time, the ego and superego start controlling its impulses, keeping the persons within the social norms and boundaries. Another integral part of the id is the libido, which is one's energy that we get from the life and death drives. Life standing for driving us to life, pleasures, and generally the things that we like, uh, against the death drive that pulls us to the things that we get pain out of, but still end up getting more libido. Libido itself is the pleasure we get out of things and does not have to be limited to sex. It spreads out to all good feelings we can encounter, like satisfying one's thirst, talking with friends, or watching a good movie. But libido does not appear in one immediately after birth. Rather, it slowly develops through a person's upbringing, developing in five phases. First comes the oral phase, where the obtained libido mainly comes from the mouth, for example, in instances like the food. Then the anal phase, relating to the sphincter and defecation. Then the phallic phase, with libido being obtained through urination. And the later two stages, with both related to one's sexuality. First, latency phase, which is in charge of shame, and then genital phase, which comes with puberty and is the last stage of libidinous development. Although sometimes, as Freud has said, some have their development stop if they get too attached to the previous phase, halting one's development. An overpowering id in an individual can drive them out of normal social boundaries. Usually, ego and superego control or restrict the id, but if they do not have the power to do so, the individual goes down to the state of tunnel visioning the craved pleasures, leading to inappropriate social behavior and aggression if the wanted things is not obtained in the moment. Since the patience is absent within the id, long-term thinking for one's future also dissociates, so one's complete concentration goes to the here and now, practically becoming an animal, since that is what id represents in an individual.
Contrary to the id and the ego, superego is the last human psyche to develop out of the three. The superego has the role of incorporating the values and morals of society which we learned from one's parental figures and other idols. The superego starts to develop between the age 3 to 5, during the phallic stage of psychosexual development. The primary role of the superego is to suppress entirely any urges or demands of the id that are considered in any way wrong or socially unacceptable. It also tries to force the ego to chase after moralistic goals rather than following the reality principle. And as such, it attempts to force the person to strive for moral perfections without taking reality into account. The superego functions through two separate systems, ego ideal and the conscience. Ego ideal, as the name implies, is the part of the superego that is responsible for what we strive to become. It is an imaginary picture of how you wish to be. It includes career aspirations, the way you act towards others, and how you act as a member of society. The conscience is a system that is responsible for conditioning the ego to strive for moralistic perfections. As such, it is capable of punishing or rewarding the ego through respectively the feeling of guilt and pride. For example, if the ego decided to take actions that fall short of the ego ideal, or if the ego gives in to its demands, the superego may punish it by making us feel guilty. On the other hand, when the ego follows the ego ideal, or resists its temptations, the superego may reward the ego by making us feel accomplished or prideful. An example of this could be getting an A on a test. How much pride and guilt we feel heavily depends on the dominance of the superego and or how high our ego ideal is. If the superego isn't very dominant, and as such the id is dominant, we won't experience much guilt when the ego gives in to its demands. Otherwise, if the superego is overly dominant, giving into the id's desires or failing to reach the ego ideal, might cause us experience immense guilt and shame. If the ego ideal is too high in standards, then whatever the person does will result in failure, causing them to experience never-ending anxiety and low self-confidence. Furthermore, if the superego is overly dominant, these standards for moral perfections will become one of the driving forces of the ego. This would in turn cause its pleasure principle to almost become irrelevant. This would in turn create a person that might seem rather emotionless and very judging towards others around them.